Welcome. Sorry, excuse me. Hold on. That's why I got some water here. I apologize. That was unprofessional. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's part of our continuing series where we talk to professors, data researchers who aren't professors, other scholars, thinkers, philosophers, reporters, columnists, and even just plain old activists. Anybody who can form complete sentences and think thoughtfully about the topics that we're covering here. We don't care what side you come from, what agenda you have. We want to provide quality information for the public. And we expect you, the public, to do something that's kind of out of favor these days, but we're kind of insistent on it. You're going to have to think for yourself. So, with us today is Nick Mullins. He was a Master of Science in Political Science, 2017 to 21 at Illinois State University. He wrote this thesis, Deepening Partisan Identity Polarization in the U.S., a content analysis of major party platforms, looking from 1980 to 2016, an almost 30-year period. This is the study itself, came out in 2021, and it looked at 1980 to 2016, which is why I was really impressed with this study. It's very holistic. And as I was talking with Nick before we got started, there's a lot of studies on political polarization, but not as many are as holistic. They kind of look at the last couple of years or a particular period, maybe like 20 years ago. That's when they were published. Looking at something over such a large variety, large distance of time, and then coming to a summation is kind of unique with the studies with political polarization. This study examines Democrat and Republican Party platforms with the 1980 to 2016 period in a content analysis to test claims of partisanship increasing on identity lines in American politics. As a key issue facing democracies in recent years, polarization has coincided with challenges for democratic governance. Cases of pernicious polarization, that means ongoing away and constantly kind of lingering, that extend partisan rifts into social life, and especially those that feature an existential or formative rift dynamic, as in the U.S. case, may be prone to intractable partisan conflict and politics amenable to democratic erosion. May be prone to intractable partisan conflict, that means can't get fixed, can't get out of it, and politics amenable to democratic erosion, that means a government system that is kind of on the verge of having everything collapse. The tensions may also create space for democracy enhancements. That's kind of positive. The findings of the content analysis offer support for increasing partisan identity polarization in American politics in recent decades. Republican Party platforms seem to increasingly reproduce a historical majoritarian appeal on religious, cultural, or ethnic identity lines, in contrast to Democratic Party platforms that likewise increasingly contest the meaning of American in more identitarian, albeit inclusive, in a more multicultural sense of community and belonging. Some of the chapters there: partisan to pernicious polarization, partisanship and its influence, partisan dynamics, possible positive or negative implications of positive partisanship, democratic functions against extreme partisanship, systems of democracy in the third reverse wave, factors in deconsolidation, partisanship and deconsolidation trends. So let's go right to the source. Nick Mullins, what is this study about? And why did you write it in 2021? Why did you think 2 years ago, not now, 2 years in the past, why did you think, oh, this is something that needs to get done, and this is a good idea? Why was this a good idea, and why was this a good idea 2 years ago? What were you saying? What were you thinking?
Yeah, and thanks for having me, Marcus, and I appreciate the introduction. I think what happened was, like, during my grad school years, I was focusing on it. I was a comparative politics or comparative political science focus, looking at global politics and culture, but I always had this American politics lens, still just comparing America, what's going on else or outside of the U.S., just what's going on in the world. So I think I was always interested, especially when, a lot of people during 2016, they were surprised by the election of Donald Trump. They were surprised by Brexit and these different just sort of bubbling trends around the world of maybe many would describe it as this far right ascendancy or a right wing kind of ascendancy in different places around the world. And nobody thought that Donald Trump would be elected president. And there
Thank
were
you.
different studies just suggesting that a lot of these things were like more coming from like a religious or cultural identity sense. There's this identitarian right wing is what people kept referring to, things around the world just kind of emerging and dominating elections. And a lot of this, what's coinciding at the same time is you mentioned the third reverse wave was one of the subheadings in the thesis. And what that references to is Samuel Huntington. He basically described three waves of democracy throughout the world in history, which basically there were different ebbs and flows where we would have an increasing democratization around the world, and then there would be subsequent reverse waves of democratization. But we were in our third wave of democratization sometime around the 1970s up till about 2006, when there was actually a turning point around the world towards this, they call it autocratization, or a rise in authoritarianism. And that trend since 2006 has been pretty consistent. And what drew my interest in this American politics question around identity, issues of belonging, is that even the US has been swept up in these de-democratizing trends where several indicators, whether there's the VDIM Institute, Freedom House, a handful of others that would basically look at the US government and saying that over the last several years, maybe coming from about 2010, 2012, we've been on this kind of subtle but declining path, moving towards more of an authoritarian level of government. I think it was the US polity scale, if I'm remembering right, that basically in 2021 actually described the US as an anocracy, which is sort of a hybrid between a democracy and an autocratic system of government. And a lot of that, from my research and from other scholars, have suggested that this is coming from this extreme or pernicious polarization in the US, where when you say pernicious, that's borrowing from McCoy and Ziblatt. They've done a handful of essays on this, but they describe pernicious polarization as an extension of polarization from not just political scene, but into everyday social life. And it's a divide between us and them that's so extreme that, political opponents don't even view each other as legitimate opponents anymore. They're looking at each other as enemies, or someone that's basically going to be here to destroy American democracy. And I think you can see that from both the Republican end of things and the Democrats, where, they're not talking to each other at the bar. They're not going to the same places. They're segregating where they live these days. And it's increasing, I think, to this point. I don't think it's going to slow down, and I'm not sure how it's going to slow down, but I'll kind of pause there. I can go into greater detail on the thesis.
There's a lot there. So I want to come back to anocracy. I don't want to get on it yet. I want to come back to it. Have you, just real quick have you heard of the book, How Civil Wars Start, by CIA analyst Barbara Walters?
I think I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
So she's come out the last 2 years, and she said, I am a CIA analyst. Not a field agent. She's not a spy. She does the data and then tells them. So that's why she can say who she is. So she's out of San Diego. She worked for the CIA for the last 20 years. So basically what she did was she and other experts created a list of matrices that would show when a country is about to slide into chaos. How close are we to full breakdown of the government, civil war, people getting shot in the streets, etc. Because I imagine you have CIA agents, or you have operations going on. You'd kind of want to know, hey, the government's going to collapse tomorrow, or we have another 10 years. So this was something the CIA would use a lot. And over the last 20 years, they got pretty damn good with their prediction matrix on when a country is going to fall or collapse into chaos. And it was a variety of different things. She's written her book because in the last 2 years, she has said that this matrices that she developed with experts over 2 decades for the CIA, looking at foreign countries, is now showing America's ticking off everything towards, bad times. So, and one of the things that she said, there were 2 conditions that allowed for civil wars to start. One was anocracy, what you just said. So I was surprised. Yeah. So folks, pay attention here. Barbara Walters, CIA analyst, is saying When countries fall into anocracy, it gets bad. We just heard from another data researcher who wasn't totally familiar with it, also saying, yeah, there's this thing called anocracy. And when that happens, things get bad. So when I see two different data points, you know, and unless you are colluding with Professor Walters before you came on this interview, then I'm maybe anocracy.
No, that's interesting. You point that out as well. I'm not.
It's bad, right? Anocracy is bad. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Still there?
Yeah. Sorry, we had a little bit of a blip. Anocracy is bad,
okay.
right? I mean, just for the public to follow along, it's bad. We don't want that. Why is it bad, and why do you think America's there now?
Yeah, that's really interesting that you brought that up, because I was just thinking as I was going over my notes, looking back on blowing off the dust of the thesis, but there's what's called the Fragile State Index. And one thing that I pointed out that I thought was really important to this issue that I didn't touch a lot on in the thesis, because it was kind of like a related but not directly related, so I had to follow my thesis committee, but they have something called the cohesion indicator trends, which look at three different factors: the security apparatus, the factionalized elites, and group grievance. And in the US, this cohesion indicator over the last several years, and every once in a while I'll go back and check the Fragile State Index, the cohesion index continues to get worse for the US, which is a critical component of just a democratic society and just a functional, legitimate like state or US government, because cohesion is one of the roots of and foundations of like a legitimate state that's actually functioning and able to, you know, execute on policy and so forth. Now,
what's it called? A cohesion index?
Yeah, it's the Fragile State Index. And this was they have a number of different indicators, but it's basically looking at state capacity. The cohesion indicator was one that I thought I've continued to just call it out. And like I remember back in grad school, just bringing this up with a couple of other comparative scholars, but it's just one that keeping an eye on as like we're watching these trends in democratic politics or more of an authoritarian creep in democracies. Cohesion in the US, I think, is like, you know, it's unprecedented that we're seeing these things in this so-called consolidated democracy, except for times like, you know, the 1960s polarization between like civil rights, or, you know, going back further, there's, you know, different episodes of polarization, but it's a little different these days.
Yeah, I'm at it's called the fragilestateIndex.org, and you can go to indicators for cohesion index. There's 12 indicators. Let me see if I can pull those up. Fragile States Index and CAST Framework Methodology. We're not going to get into it because I don't want to like eat up the bandwidth, but basically, yes, the Fragile States Index at the has a cohesion index in it. Oh, this is the book. So is it okay if I tell you a little bit about this book? And then I wanted to ask you a question about that. Okay. How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them by Barbara F. Walter. I'm sorry, it's not Walters, and I keep getting it wrong because she's not the reporter Barbara Walters. She's Barbara F. Walter, different woman, unrelated. But she came out the last two. Here's her book. She's been all over the place saying the same thing, raising alarm bells. Walter has a political science fondness for data sets and numerical scales. She says the United States is firmly within the danger zone of a 5-point scale measuring factionalism and a 21-point scale measuring the country's polity index. Or a full autocracy gets a -10 and a full democracy gets a +10. We've slid from +10 to +5 in a few years, occupying what Walter and her colleagues call the not quite democratic and not quite autocratic zone of an anocracy. And she says that's bad. So the numbers serve a function corralling troubling observations into a cold system of measurement that presents itself as beyond dispute, seemingly nonpartisan and scientific. The numbers also show her to offer empirical grounding for her work while she makes her way towards some blunt conclusions. Today, the Republican Party is behaving like a predatory faction. So she's saying anocracy is one of the things. The other one is an ethnic entrepreneur seeking to amass power by making bigoted appeals to a particular group. Doesn't need an especially sophisticated disinformation campaign to get people to feel fearful and despairing, convincing them to turn against democracy that includes people they hate. There's comfort in assuming that autocracy has to arrive with a military coup. Now it's being ushered in by the voters themselves. America lucked out, Walter said, because its first modern autocratic president was neither smart nor politically experienced. She ticks off risk factors that have already been met here: factionalism, democratic decay, loss of guns. There's also crucially one dominant group whose members are fearful that their status is slipping away. It's the downtrodden masses that start a civil war, Walter says, but rather what she and her few fellow scholars call sons of the soil. The privileged position was once so unquestioned and pervasive that they simply assume it's their due and they will take violence in order to cling to power. Okay. Key concept is anocracy, a transition stage of government between autocracy and democracy. The transition can be made in either direction, and it is during the transition that civil wars erupt. So it's not necessarily in a full autocracy. It's not necessarily in a full democracy. It's in this anocracy middle region is where most civil wars erupt. That's number one. Condition number two is ethnic entrepreneur. Hey, folks, us used to have it pretty good. And now these new folks are coming in and taking all our jobs, or making it bad for us, or taking over our country, and we're the actual Volk or folk, etc. Thoughts, feelings about a CIA analyst that saying the same thing that you are, that it looks like America's going into anocracy, and that's a really horrible position to be in? Does her theory sound outlandish to you? I know you haven't read the book. I know you're not a CIA analyst too, but just off the surface, not an expert, does what she's saying sound like crazy talk, or does it kind of line up with what you've seen?
Yeah, I don't think I would describe it as crazy talk, because I've heard some very respectable people, and this question has come up to me in the thesis defense, was, do I think that we're headed towards a civil war? And so there are some respectable people that I think do believe that that's a possibility, but based on my research, I'm not sure if that is exactly the case, just because of the context of U.S. democracy. We have our red and blue states, but then at the same time, you might have like Illinois, it's like a 55-45. There's still a good chunk of the population that would, vote red the entire, full scale every time. Same thing in Florida. There's a consolidation of conservatives or Republican power, but there's still a good chunk of the population that is Democrat in that sense. But what I think is probably more likely, and this was fascinating because as I was diving into this thesis project, I didn't know that in the summer of 2020, we would have the George Floyd killing by police that would lead to these riots sparking up all across the U.S. and even around the world. I didn't think that January 6th in 2021 or would happen a year later, just to see all this kind of political turmoil coming up from both sides of the aisle. And increasingly, I think we're going to continue to see these episodes of just kind of sporadic, or I think we'll call it stochastic terrorism is what the academic term is. But basically just episodes of political violence where you have somebody on, and we've seen this on both sides, where you're radicalized to the extent that they feel compelled to act, to commit just some like random act of violence, whether it's like a mass shooting or worse, or just, even clashes at protests between two sides of this activist extreme wings of both sides of the aisle. But just to give you some context too, I looked at comparative examples of just, some less extreme cases of partisan identity polarization. You might have, like in the UK, there's been the Brexit issue, where really it's followed the same path of pernicious polarization, where the Leavers and Remainers, they don't talk to each other. They don't want to marry each other. It's gone into this social life.
Yeah.
And a couple other examples, Ivory Coast, Kenya, Poland, they've all had these patterns of extreme or exclusionary rhetoric towards the other party. But the more extreme cases, I think Rwanda, I'm just going to toss out the most extreme case probably of this pernicious polarization was Rwanda, because in pre-colonial Rwanda, they were the Hutu and the Tutsi that shared distinctions. They shared relationships and beliefs in this single society. But with colonialism in the early 20th century, there was this group distinction by the Belgians in order to gain more control and dominance in society. The Hutu majority rose to power, and there was no longer this middle ground in society, and there became this like dynamic of dehumanizing dichotomy, like a Manichaean splitting between Rwandan society, and that grew to the extent of just narratives of elimination of the other side, just because they viewed each other as the enemy. The Hutus saw the Tutsis as an existential threat through the Rwandan nation, not unlike I think in the U.S. case, we'll see, the Republicans are a threat to American democracy. The Democrats will have that saying. The Republicans will look at Democrats and say they're a fascist threat to democracy. We view each other as enemies and a threat to the nation anymore. And in Rwanda, this grew to an extent of genocide. I don't think that's likely the case in the U.S. What we're probably more likely to see is this subtle path of democratic erosion, or this anocracy, as Barbara Walters has described. I'll quit rambling for a second and let you respond to that. But there are a couple
I'm sorry, Mike. When you said Rwanda, I mean, I'm no longer shocked by what I hear. I'm sorry. That was just the sobering assessment. I was picturing Rwanda type violence happening here. And it's, you try to be impartial. You try not to be emotional. You try to be, accepting and academic for everybody who's watching this. But sometimes, I'm a human. That's a scary thought. That's a terrifying thought. I remember scenes of Rwanda. I was a child when I was a teenager when it was going on. It's ridiculous. Let me ask you about Bosnia. Bosnia was another society. They had periods of violence going back, thousands of hundreds of years, but they were also somewhat cohesive during the Czechoslovakian period for maybe like 50 years. And then they dramatically broke up and started turning on each other. Similarities between Bosnia and here? Do you see any?
I think what the similarities would be are just that this polarization became along these identitarian or identity lines, where you have, like just in the American case, the Republicans look at the U.S. as and define American identity in one sense. In the thesis, I described that as a historical majoritarian view of what it means to be American. But since the 1980s, what my research has shown is that there's been less and less rhetoric on neutral identity grounds in terms of what it means to be American, less universal description of what it means to be American. And more, there's been this identitarian lens from both the Republicans and the Democrats in their party platforms, where the Democrats, as we talked about a little bit, are increasingly looking at American society, defining American society as this multicultural, emphasizing differences between ethnic groups or minorities or different gender identities and sexual identities, where the Republicans have been relatively consistent in their historical majoritarian idea of what it means to be American, but they've also emphasized that more and more. I think a lot of that is that ratchet effect, or sort of a reciprocal response to, one party's doing or has this narrative, so we have to counteract that and really emphasize our narrative of what it means to be American. And in Bosnia, I think what that leads to is it's difficult when you're talking about belonging and identity in a nation, because that's when this existential threat situation comes up, is that if you believe this is one way of what our nation or belonging means, and I believe it's another, then I think you're an existential threat to my political identity and what it means to just live in this society. So that's where things can get really tricky and difficult to pull back from.
I got a lot of questions on that. I do want to, and I appreciate you tying it back to your research. So everybody, this is the description of the research, and he was tying it back to his research. I just want to ask you a quick question before we deep dive on the research. There was a few people who study world politics. In fact, we were talking to an expert on the Bosnia conflict who doesn't even study right now because it was so violent and it kind of got to him. But what he said was that an unrecognized and unappreciated factor of the cause of the Bosnia conflict, this is from a world recognized expert, and he goes, here's something that everybody kind of missed when they were talking about the Bosnia conflict. They're going ethnic this, ethnic that, rural urban divide. He said what happened was most of the rural areas was one ethnic group, one religion, kind of homogenous. And the cities were places where Muslims and Jews and Croats and Greek people would go. So the cities kind of had this identity of cosmopolitan, not us, the people. They're different, they're diverse. There's a lot of them in the cities, whereas out here in the countryside, we don't get anybody who's not ethnically Serbian and 100% Orthodox Christian church. And so you had this divide organically, where after they're coming out of Czechoslovakia, they're like, okay, we're in the rural areas and we're kind of poor and we don't have everything, but we're all one ethnic group, one kind of mind. And then you go into the cities and it gets very diverse. And so what happened was the rural areas started looking at the cities as different, foreign, opposite. And that's why you had a lot of the violence in the cities from the surrounding countryside. Thoughts, feelings on that compared to what you've seen? And also, I just want to throw out there, they're talking about a rural-urban divide here in California, in America, as a major source for political division. Thoughts, feelings on that?
Yeah, I think that especially because we live in different places now. I mean, Democrats hover in the more urban concentrated areas and Republicans tend to be in, maybe more suburban or rural areas. And what that only does is that, it continues to just drive us apart in a way that, we have this idea of ideal way of life and what we're doing as Americans and how we think things need to be. Whereas there's a totally different idea from the other side. And I don't think that's going to have any positive impact when we just continue to segregate ourselves when, we already don't want to hang out at the same places. We don't want to go to the same churches. We don't want to, even to the extent of like family members. If you have a family member who's of the opposite party, it's just, you don't want to associate with them. You see people shutting people out of their lives. There's one quote that I wanted to share that I think kind of illustrates this point too. It was in a book called How Democracies Die by Levitsky and Ziblatt. Great book. It was written in 2018, but they basically, here's the quote, I'll just read it, is in 1960, political science asked Americans how they would feel if their child married someone who identified with another political party. In 1960, that was 4% of Democrats and 5% of Republicans reported they would be displeased, quote. In 2010, they did the same study. 33% of Democrats and 49% of Republicans reported feeling that they'd be, quote, somewhat or very unhappy at the prospect of inter-party marriage. So in other words, being a Democrat or Republican has become not just a partisan affiliation, but an identity. And that's where that just rift in social life of political identity is sort of driving this pattern of pernicious polarization in the U.S.
I'm getting tripped up because you're so familiar with the topic. I have like 50 questions I want to ask you at every second. But I'm trying to find it. We have covered that extensively. There was a Time magazine article talking about how people won't date outside their political preference anymore. And it was, here we go. This is the same data, I'm sure from a different source, but what you've been getting at. Would you date somebody with different political beliefs? Here's a survey of 5,000 single people surveyed. Blah, 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 blah. Singles in America reports 1/3 in 2012 to more than half in 2020. So in about an 8-year period, we went from sizable, but a minority, clearly a minority, 2/3 not doing this. Yeah, there's some people that do it, but 2/3 don't. To every other group, it's every other household is now like, no, we don't date somebody outside of our political ideology. So there is something with the rural urban. Yeah. I want to ask you a question, then I want to get back to this. Ethnic entrepreneur. Barbara Walter talked about an ethnic entrepreneurs. Hey, Rwanda, Tutsis, Bosnia. We're our group. We used to have it good, or we could have it better. We're disenfranchised. Come on, guys, let's get together and, help ourselves out. So that's how those civil wars and genocides happened. We have a guy now called Donald Trump. Hey, he doesn't exactly say this, but as a Latino, he dog whistles. So I've had this argument with fellow conservatives like, well, he didn't say that. And I'm like, Okay, but when he goes, Mexicans, they bring rapists, they are rapists, I don't know, whatever. And then he eats a taco salad the next day and doesn't apologize. You know damn well what's going on. Let's just cut the nonsense. So, Donald Trump, some would say, you don't have to take the stance, I'll play it independent, that he's an ethnic entrepreneur, that he is reaching out to Caucasian people in the Midwest and the South who feel that America was more for them and feel that now, they can't get the jobs because the Mexicans are here. They can't do this because they got the immigrants coming in here. It used to be our country, used to be for us, white working man. Now I can't do this. I can't get that. Opioid deaths, higher death rate in general, more despair, lack of income, lowering poverty. Anything to that? Maybe Donald Trump is an ethnic entrepreneur, or this is a kind of a silly idea to even paint him in that brush.
No, I think that's fair, and this is probably going to be an unpopular opinion, but I'll go back to the both sides are doing this sort of thing, and I think the way that I can show some evidence of that is that both parties have been leaning more on this identitarian language, where Trump may be demonizing immigrants or minorities in a certain way with some of these dog whistles. On the Democratic Party side of things, they're labeling their opponents as fascists, and they'll point to certain legislation from the Republicans and say, like, this is like, they're killing, genociding us, but none of these things are happening necessarily. I think it's a lot of it is there's exaggeration from both sides of the aisle of just how bad or what the other side has done to them, and it's that kind of victimization card on both ends of it. And I think that's a lot of it going back to that, they each side viewing the others as the threat to their sense of community, their understanding of American identity and belonging. So that's again where this issue becomes tricky, and I think we'll see more and more of these dog whistles. More and more of just calling, like, Democrats are just going to increasingly say, like, the fascist threat's going to be elected and America's going to end tomorrow or something. And then on the same end, you're going to have the Republicans looking at Democrats and saying these policies are, they're going to ruin our kids. They're bringing drugs, whatever, that the old Trump quote that we can bring up. But I think it's an issue that's coming from both ends.
I appreciate that. You've been really excellent at this, really well informed. And I find it a sadness that people aren't coming to you more and asking more from your opinion and essays, because I've interviewed a lot of people and not as many people are familiar with some of the basic data here. For example, it's happening on both sides. I can't tell you the number of people who are like, Republicans, 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 Republicans. And I go, what about, and I'm showing it right now, when Joe Biden went on TV with a blood red backdrop and 2 active duty Marines. No U.S. president's ever done that. Usually they don't have military people by their side. It kind of suggests an authoritarian feel. And he said 78 million Americans are enemies of the state. In fact, it was so bad that his own party was getting backlash and independents saying, damn, Joe, sounds like you called half the country an enemy. We liberals and independents don't even think that's a good idea for calming tensions down. I have to bring this up to a lot of people who are Republicans, 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 Republicans. And I go, but what about this? This helps division to say the other half of the country is an enemy of the state, or it only makes things worse?
Yeah, that's you hit it right on the head there. Like, just referring to the other as the enemy of the state is, that's basically saying that you're no longer a legitimate political opponent, as in a healthy democracy would be. It's looking at them as like, well, if you got elected, we can't let that happen. We have to do everything to stop that from happening, as far as you're going to destroy the nation if you're elected, and vice versa. Both sides see it that way. And, that's the point of, I don't want to say no return, but it's just hard to see. I don't know how we come out of that. And most of the research I've looked into on this topic is that usually it comes down to one party consolidates majority rule, and there's a permanent minority party, or there's just going to be what they refer to as this careening back and forth, as in what we've mostly seen in the U.S. case, where, in 4 years, maybe we'll have the other party in power, and then it'll quickly change. 4 years later, Congress flips every 2 years or so, or whatever, what have you, and policies just completely unstable, and we don't get anything done. Our government's legitimacy continues to decline. People continue to lose trust in government, and it's kind of it's a vicious little ratchet effect, a cycle that we're in.
Let's get into some of the meat and potatoes. And I typed that out before you even brought it up again. Doesn't think it will get better in the future. This is somebody who's been studying it. Let me ask you some of the other stuff, some of the basics. So when did it start to get bad? You're looking at 1980 to 2016. Talk to me like I'm a lay public. I have no background. I'm just coming into this. Just for the sake of this, you're an expert. You looked at 1980 to 2016. Boy, that's a big period of time. When do you think pernicious polarization? Obviously, there's going to be some trickling going from an early point here, but when do you notice that went from a nuisance to that's bad? Obviously, it's always been here. When did we go from, okay, you got to put up with it, we can deal with this too? That wound's infested now. When was
Yes. So, as you said, party polarization's always been a thing. It's always existed on at least some set of issues for most of our history. I'll do a quick rundown of in the 1790s, we had, polarization over tariffs. 1830s and 40s, there's polarization over similar issues in federal versus state and citizen power. Then we've had slavery, of course, 1850s, 1890s, it was over agrarian and currency, social welfare programs in the 1930s. But this was always usually over one or two set of issues, like single issue polarization. Civil rights was the issue in the 1960s with polarization. But from the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s, what's happened instead is that it's been more of an extension of polarization, so that party conflict is extending over not just from older issues to newer issues, but actually extending across several issues, where you see that basically you can tick some boxes and see on every one of these, it'll be full on Republicans. Here's their position. Here's the Democrats' position on, maybe it's climate change, or what's taught in schools, economic principles, and we used to have liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. Now we only have liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans. And that's just illustrates how far we've come into this polarization. And it is a little bit different than the past. It's been growing since about the 1990s. And I think it's increased still, even since I wrote the thesis.
Ding, ding, ding. Chicken dinner. You're the winner. You hit on a couple key things. So why the 90s? Why did you say the 90s? You're looking at 1980 to 2016. Why do you, in your opinion, I didn't prompt you, you said it on your own, why do you think it starts or starts to significantly trend? Let's say that it starts to significantly trend like this is going to be a problem, folks, in the 1990s. And before you start, yeah. I'm sorry. This is my favorite story as a boy. You can go back to the early revolutionary founding fathers, and I think it was John Adams called Thomas Jefferson a transvestite or something like that. So there is polarization, there is rough talk throughout America's history, and that's part of democracy. But you and I are talking about, okay, there's this, and then now it's so why the 90s? What's going on in the 90s? Why do you think the 90s is different than the 80s or 2000s? Or what's going on in the 90s? Why do you think the trend really picks up or starts? It becomes pernicious or worth paying attention at that particular moment in time?
I think that's tough. I mean, a lot of it is probably just the de facto increasingly diverse multicultural American society we've had. I mean, we're a lot more diverse and multicultural now than we were in the 80s and 70s, 60s, and so forth. And that's probably a big part of it. The Republicans kind of maintained their historical majoritarian view of what it means to be American. The Democrats adopted kind of a new idea of what that means. And it's really interesting too, because you can see in the 1980 Republican Party platform, they were actually more, I guess their language is a little bit more multicultural or like pro-diversity than the Democrats. And there's a little bit of like flux between the years. But even in like the 2004 Republican Party platform, their narrative on, identity and belonging was probably closer to what a Democratic Party platform would be. But these things they were in flux throughout that period, but there was that general trend of increasing partisan identity polarization on both sides of that. The other side of that table or lens of why is this happening now could be just the economic transformation. There's been more globalization has transpired throughout this period of time, and there's been, declining, standard of living in the U.S. Things are changing in terms of how the economy is affecting people. There's been deindustrialization, a loss of jobs in certain parts of the world, especially these former industry towns or factory towns where people are like, they're losing hope and they're going to, the diseases of despair, those types of things. And what this identity messaging does is it's, politicians aren't, addressing the economic problems for them necessarily, but they're giving them something else to cling on to. So that's kind of the general take that I have, is that there's, on the one end, you have a de facto increasing multicultural, diverse society. On the other end, we have deindustrialization through globalization, lost jobs, and standard of living in certain parts of the U.S.
Okay, that's good. Let me ask you about this. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot. We have a lot of data, but when you said the 1990s, we've been talking to a lot of people and still holding our conclusions till later, but a lot of people are pointing at the 90s. A lot of people are going, yeah, I don't think it's the last 5 years. Yes, obviously it got worse. Obviously nobody saw January 6th happening. Obviously that's a super bad. But if we can go to when did things seem to stop working normally and putting us on this path, a lot are putting 90s. There's some maps I'll show you in a second. I do want to get to this though. Again, you're looking at 1980s to 2016. And one of the things you said initially when we were talking was you noticed that there was less rhetoric on universal language, like we're all Americans over time. Can you talk about that? When did you start to see a drop off in, I guess you're talking about speeches by politicians or addresses, like when did you start to see somewhat of a drop off, or is there a period where you can say, yeah, that's definitely the drop off period where there seems to be less, hey guys, we're all Americans here? Because even Bush W, whether you hated him, talked like that. And Barack Obama, whether you hated him or liked him, talked like that. And that seems to be gone. When did this start?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll clarify that with the data in my thesis. This was all driven from the party platform narrative. So to just give you kind of a short spiel on how that worked is I created a coding rubric and I used paragraphs as my unit of analysis between a universal category of that message, identitarian category of that message, where the identitarian's more of like a, referring to subgroups or minorities or kind of distinguishing different groups in American society. I had a hybrid category that kind of touches on both of those. And then there was this none or neutral category where the paragraph doesn't mention or isn't concerned with American identity. And so in 1980, it started that universal messaging was, or neutral messaging was the dominant narrative. There wasn't much sense of like, here's American identity, and it wasn't as salient of an issue for both Republicans and Democrats. So it was about 80% for the Democrats in 1980 that was neutral messaging. And for Republicans, it was about 74% of that was neutral messaging. And there was it started as a subtle decline from about 1980 to 1992 in that neutral messaging, with a bit of an uptick in identitarian, universal, or hybrid messaging. But what really is striking is that the big jump was from 2004 to 2016, where we went from about 5% identitarian messaging in the Democratic Party platform up to 33%. So they went from almost none to about 1/3 of their party platform messaging was tailored towards this question of American identity in that democratic sense, where they have that more multicultural version of what it means to be American or American society.
5% to 30%.
Yes, about 30% is what the 2016 party platform for the Democrats looked like.
I apologize for interrupting. I just want to make sure that the audience can follow along. So is this right? What I'm writing down here is a subtle decline 1980, 1992, but big jump from 2004 to 2016. We're going from 5% identity messaging to 30% in just that short period. That is I have not seen those numbers before, and that seems pretty striking.
Yeah, for the Republicans, it was actually a little more subtle. Like I said, the Republicans were more consistent and just kind of sticking to this historical majoritarian way of communicating what it means to be American. But there was from 5% up to about 11% jump from that 2004 to 2016 period, which matches this was the peak for Republicans when those things occurred, and that was the peak for Democrats and their party platforms, where each party is treating this identity issue as more salient and communicating that in their party platform.
We're seeing different percentages for the party, but there's definitely a dramatic increase. So we're looking at 5% to 30 is like, I don't know, 500% increase, and 5 to 11%, while 11 may be small, that's still a 200% increase. So same period, they're both doing it. And as you were saying, the Republicans had a little bit more identity messaging historically, periodically. So maybe they didn't have to like lean into it as much as the Democrats because they were already there. That's fascinating. That is the answer I was looking for. I never heard about that. That is a great data set. So folks, if you look at the Democrat and Republican Party platforms, what they said were about, and you looked at the messaging, there was a lot of, we got the right ideas. These guys are idiots, but hey, we're all Americans. And then around 2092, that sort of kind of started to peter down, but you had a big decrease from 2004 to 2016, where both parties in their platforms, their official statements about what we are as a party, are increasingly using identity-based messaging. And we're looking at an increase in 2004 to 16, maybe 12 years. Well, let's just round it off to a decade. I know we're rounding down, but in about a decade, you have a 500% increase in one party and a 200% increase in the other party. That's madness. Wow. Okay. Wow. Kind of shocked. Because I wanted to ask, when did it get bad? How did it get bad? You're kind of showing that. So may I show you a map and ask you a few questions based upon that?
Sure.
Okay. Have you heard of the big sort?
Yep.
Okay.
The party sorting, I think, is what you're referring to, right?
Yeah. So here we go. Just want to get your thought on this because you are very familiar with the data. So the big sort. It was a book about how people are sorting themselves into ideologically based communities. There is some serious debate on if people are intentionally, consciously doing that, or if they're subconsciously doing it and kind of falling into the position. Fine. I frankly don't care about that debate. I'm more concerned, is it happening or not? So NPR documented this in 2008. They also said it's still going on in 2017. And then they also went back in 2021 after January 6th. And they said, yep, it's still there. And then we had the New York Times backed it up, and Wall Street Journal, Daily Yonder, Sabato Cristobal Center for Politics, Wall Street Journal. Here's the thing I like asking people about. Okay, so these are maps of presidential elections at county level, I believe, or at least they're at the county level for elections. In the top far left is 1992. Top far left, top and all the way to the left. Red means don't even run here if you're a Democrat. You have no chance. Republicans always win by 20 percentage points over the other guy. That's called landslide county. Blue means don't even run here if you're a Republican. You have no chance. Democrats always win by 20 percentage points or more. Gray means it's competitive. Sometimes we feel like a Republican. Sometimes we like Obama's messaging. The next year we like McCain's messaging. We're open. Who's got the better idea? Who seems to fit the moment of the country? We can be persuaded. Although there is people in ideological backgrounds. Now you go 96, 2000, come down to 2004, about the middle, 2008, 2012, go to 2016. Almost all the gray is completely wiped out from 1992. By the way, these maps still hold. So what this is showing is you have these people, they're moving to communities, and then they seem to be voting the way everybody in that community does. Maybe not right away, but eventually they kind of like just gel into it. There, like I said, there's some debate on I hate liberals, so I'm going to move to Texas and vote Republican versus I just feel more comfortable in a rural Christian gun-backed environment. And then eventually I start going, your opinion on abortion makes sense to me too. As a debate, I really don't care, but does this sorting map make sense that from the 1992 to 2016, we could start to see not elites, not social media companies, the people themselves moving into ideological communities. And now we almost have no fair battleground counties at all. It's almost all hardcore red, hardcore blue. And it used to not be this way in the 1990s. We used to have competitive elections at a national landscape. Thoughts, feelings about these maps and the big sort in general?
Yeah, I think it's a pattern that goes along with this political environment that we're kind of stuck in, or it seems like we're stuck in. And it's something that, I think it's accurate to say that people are trying to move to places that, where the culture is their political preference. And that's typically how it ends up. I think the same thing tends to happen with, choosing even like your workplace, choosing your friends, choosing your loved ones these days, whether it's like, I'm not going to talk to my uncle or my dad because they don't have the same political values as me anymore. So I think a lot of that's where this issue just drives into the social life aspect of it, is just that, everything we want it to agree with our political preference rather than just leaving those as like political issues in the sense of, deciding taxes or whatever. In politics, that's where things start to get onto this, legislating culture and issues of belonging. And if I could just share one example that I thought was interesting to bring up about that, is there is the case of, in the comparative lens, Zimbabwe also has had a couple periods of polarization, and one of their later period of polarization between about 2000 2008, they had this similar pattern where, to quote an essay, was marked by deeper societal penetration and segregation between the two sides of the divide. They haven't had a civil war as a result of that in this later period, but it has been, episodes of political violence, that sporadic violence, and political turmoil that we have, or we might start to see more of in the U.S.
So it doesn't have to be full on Bosnia or Rwanda. We could settle for Zimbabwe. Fair, but I would also point out Zimbabwe is like, it has the worst credit rating in the world, the highest debt rating in the entire planet. Almost no money goes in there, and investors and other people are scared to travel into the country. It's not doing well. So yeah, they did not start shooting each other, but folks, don't get the idea that if we decide into a Zimbabwe level that you're not going to notice a big drop in quality of life. It will be significant. Robert Mugabe may have had some good ideas back in the past, but he's turned into some sort of monster, as it understands, or his accolades at least. You seem very well versed on political polarization in America. I want to take you back to President's Day. I think this year, last year, Marjorie Taylor Greene, sitting member of Congress on President's Day, says, hey, blue and red can't get along with each other. We need to have a national divorce. In response, I've been reading all the articles and interviews. A bunch of people on the left and a bunch of people on the right, within 12 hours, had the exact same messaging. I've asked some political reporters about, isn't that weird that people on the left and the far right have the exact same messaging within 12 hours of each other when they have no coordination? You're not a reporter, so I don't want to really get into that. You can look at the other interviews. By the way, they said, yeah, that's kind of weird. So you had Jack Probasek on the far right saying MSNBC did a good job on reporting. You almost never see that super bizarre behavior the day after Marjorie's doing this, almost like there's a common hand behind all of them. Can't prove that, of course. Just look at the interviews with the reporters. But one thing I noticed was this. Everybody, Stephen Colbert, Breaking Points, Wonkette, The Hill TV. Oh, Marjorie, you idiot. We're not divided. What are you talking about, crazy girl? We basically all get along. Look at this. This woman's nuts. Yeah, Stephen Colbert, late night TV. Marjorie says everyone she's talking to talks about this. I bet they do, Marjorie. You're crazy. There's nothing here. You don't know what you're talking about. And what I found interesting was that all of them would come up and they go, we're not really divided. And then the other thing was within a month after that, or in the last year, you see the articles about, okay, yeah, maybe there's some political polarization, but it's because of social media. It's because of elite politicians. It's because of gerrymandering. And the thing that got me was gerrymandering was not a problem until the 2000 election. That's what a lot of political historians say. The Bush-Gore won, and then it really started picking up steam around 2010. So it goes by census. 2000 census was the first time the Republicans thought we could be playing games with this. 2010, it really got ramped up. So really, you're looking at 2010 when it's a big problem, starts at 2000. If you're looking at social media and its influence, that doesn't really get started till 2015, 2016. Maybe you can go back to 2010 as far as really going, controlling elections, 2015. If we're looking at elite politicians, that really goes back to about Donald Trump's presidency, maybe 2016, 2018, 2020. The big sort goes back to the 1990s, predating gerrymandering by 10 to 20 years, predating social media by 20 to 25 years, predating elite politicians by 30 to 35 years. Why is it that every single reporter, every single person on the news who got to speak at all within a month after Marjorie Taylor Greene speech was saying two things? One, we're not really divided, and any polarization we have is because of gerrymandering or elite politicians or social media. Why did basically everybody not bring up the big sort at all when they were criticizing Marjorie Taylor Greene, or when they're trying to talk about how there is any sort of polarization at all, especially when this has been a national news article for multiple publications over the last decade? How do multiple news agencies and multiple professors and multiple experts all forget about this national trend that's been covered all right after Marjorie Taylor Greene makes her statement? They talk about everything else but this. Why is that, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think why they're not talking about it, I don't think elites generally like to talk about the problems in that sense that America's facing, where it is an issue to talk about. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene was elected legitimately by her constituency, and maybe this was just a way of trying to just totally disregard those facts. I do think that gerrymandering has had some effect in just why these things are happening. It's kind of consolidating power in a certain sense. But I think what Marjorie Taylor Greene is doing in saying this, we need a national divorce, is just kind of a response or reaction to the political environment that we're in. Is that both sides can't see each other getting along in that sense. They would be great or happy to have the other party just move to Canada or whatever it might be, and that's just the nature of, viewing the other side as like totally illegitimate opponent and not a democratic opponent anymore, someone that's an enemy to their way of life and what it means to be American. They just don't think they belong anymore.
We have a lot of news agencies who say, we're news agencies. We check the facts. We're here to inform you. And they talked about the big sort before. And then after Marjorie Taylor Greene, they completely forgot about the earlier reporting. And how do, we're talking about multiple news agencies and multiple people and, experts and professors and lawyers coming up. Because when Marjorie Taylor Greene said that, it was controversial. A lot of people were talking. I didn't see anyone bringing up, well, actually, she's right. We are polarized. Come on, guys. We covered this here at CNN 6 months ago, 9 months ago, 18 months ago. Let's not act like we're not doing it. And by the way, there's this thing called the big sort. It's well documented. It's been covered, but I heard no one bring that up. No one brought up the big sort, and no one brought up, hey, didn't we cover how bad polarization is 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 18 months ago? It was, Marjorie, you're an idiot. We're not that divided. And if we are divided, it's because of social media and elite politicians. And if we just, get the social media companies under control and the elite politicians maybe change a few laws, everything will just snap right back together. Why did they do that, in your opinion? I understand this is my interpretation, but if you're right, believing my interpretation, why would you logically think a human would come to that action?
Yeah, it's funny they blame social media. I mean, social media has definitely had some influence, but I think it's more or less been an amplifier of our everyday social problems. We just see issues more frequently. They spread like a virus of just, what's the topic of today that we're going to talk about? And then their solution, which is actually problematic from a liberal democratic sense, is that they want to enact censorship laws or, control that narrative so that, we don't have these issues because of social media. And that's kind of a subtle effect of what this polarizing language and narratives between the two factions is doing, is that whoever's in power, they're going to try to do what they can, even if it's against democratic principles, to shut out the political opponent that they think is the threat or the reason for America's slide, basically.
We're winding down. You have been awesome and exceptionally informative, and I appreciate that. And again, I told everybody I was a little bit jealous, and I kind of don't believe you, Nick. I'm just going to call you out. This guy was saying, "Oh, I just happen to have good lighting and a perfect backdrop," and I'm like, most people plan that. According to him, that just happened today. He doesn't, didn't plan that out. It's just the map is perfectly on one side of his head, and then the seal in the background, and then he has a perfect dark matte coloring behind him. So all just coincidental. That's what he says. Okay, I'll believe you for today.
It's my meeting room, right?
So Marjorie Taylor Greene says we need national divorce. We can't get along. And I think you sort of hinted at it. You didn't seem very positive about these trends playing out or getting better naturally on their own. In response to her call for marriage counseling, a Utah governor was widely quoted in response to her call for national divorce, a Utah governor was widely quoted saying, "Marjorie, you're silly. We don't need national divorce. We need marriage counseling." But here's the thing. That was widely reported by the left and the right. We need marriage counseling. You idiot, Marjorie. We don't need national divorce. Yet no one defined it. There's another thing. I remember reading article after article, marriage counseling, she's an idiot. Marriage counseling, she's dumb. No one defined it. What does marriage counseling look like for a population of 300 million people that are as perniciously polarized as you have said and documented?
I don't think anybody would show up to the counselor's office.
Oh my God. This is from a guy that's researching it, folks. I didn't say it.
They don't want to, both sides, they don't want to come to the table and actually like have a debate. They just want to, go viral for slamming their opponent as an enemy or someone that's not legitimate to be, elected. They shouldn't be in office, whatever. I think what's probably more likely than this counseling is that we're just going to see like continued gridlock in Washington and more of that return to, state power being a little bit more important as far as actually getting policy and politics done. I mean, that where it's local is where things go on anyway, but I think we'll have some declining federal power, growing state power, but there's always going to be this, careening or this back and forth fight for the power in Washington, and both sides are going to try to, one up the opponent, and that's where it's tricky in terms of getting out of this extreme polarization. Is that it's all the incentives are there for both sides to try to reciprocate on, next level of what they can do to seal their power against their illegitimate enemy or political opponent if we're in a democracy.
The system doesn't really encourage them to reach across the aisle and compromise and tell their constituency, I compromised with Dr. Satan, but for the good of the country. It encourages them to say, trash that person, and if you don't sign a bill, but you said I didn't do anything because I hate him and he's disgusting, you get rewarded by the voters. Is that somewhat along the lines of what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think Joe Biden has been really good at, playing this, neutral arbiter, but I don't think his actual actions have spoken to that rhetoric. I mean, he'll have he'll take both sides of that coin and play that neutral arbiter who's trying to strengthen democracy, thumbs up, we can do it, yada, yada. But at the same time, he'll continue to bend to the same wing of the party that's trying to reciprocate and continue that polarizing rhetoric. And this was just like the funniest thing that I saw the other day is, don't ask me why I'm enrolled in these emails, but it was the White House gift shop. I think I was testing something out, checking something out. Now I'm apparently enrolled in the emails, but I got an email that was a White House coin they were selling that was just like injunction or something of Donald Trump. So it was basically like slamming Trump as, again, like, enemy.
As a commemorative coin.
Nice. As a commemorative coin. And in the middle of the body of the email, it said, I'm not lying, apolitical star unbiased, as they were trying to sell this coin that was slamming their political opponent as like a criminal or enemy. Yeah. I'm just like,
yeah. And liberals don't get that. If I talk to fellow liberals, they'll go, yeah, he was a criminal. That's the right thing to do. And I go, do you understand how polarizing this is? And that when you look at, and I'm Latino, and I, remember growing to ask my grandma, like, why are all these Mexicans here? And she goes, because America invaded every country in Latin America and destabilized it. And so, except for Costa Rica, guess what country is the most attractive to American corporations? Costa Rica, the one country that it destabilized, coincidentally. Anyways, so I studied failed democracies, and boy, are we ticking off everything I've been watching failed Latin American democracies do. You lost the election. Now I'm going to investigate you and imprison you and all your supporters.
Lock her up. There's, there's one partisan message, lock him up, and the other one's lock her up. It's like, it's a reciprocating effect of just both sides want to do the same thing to the other. They just don't want to say the same thing out loud all the time.
And I'm like, do you guys know? And it's sad because in America, it's American exceptionalism. Nothing that happens outside of America is applicable to Americans. This is a special, unique place. I don't care what happened. We're not like anybody else, blah, 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 blah. It's really dumb. And I go, we're doing the things that only happen in failed democracies. Like, this is not a behavior you see in other Western standard democracies. This is kind of a behavior you see in failed Latin American democracies. I know I studied it. My family came from there. And yet nobody seems to get it. I remember talking to people about, when Joe Biden said 78 million Americans are enemies of the state, maybe that didn't help calm things down. And I had a lot of fellow liberals go, he should have been more hardcore. Those people are horrible. Should have called them out more. And I'm going, the speech was already called divisive. It already scared Americans. And yet when you talk to some liberals, they're like, not hardcore enough. Should have done part 2 and 3. Good to call those people out. So I just don't see much interest in reaching out to the other side.
On that same token, it's like, if you voted for the Republicans, you're a racist or a fascist. Mm-hmm. I've had this conversation with friends like, well, my grandparents voted for the Republicans and they're not racist or fascist. And you're saying that 75 or whatever million people in America are all racist and fascist. That's like a non-starter. That just means I don't want to have anything to do with you. No conversation, no debate on the issues. That's just a totally shutting down deliberative democracy.
My stepdad, I'm not happy about this because I hate Trump, but he voted for Trump. He voted for Trump for tax policies. If you had money and you had business, Trump was good on tax policies. They won't talk about that, but he was. And, they'll call him a white supremacist. And he goes, and then he's hanging out at the house, and I'm there, and I'm half Latin. His wife, my mom, is full Mexican. His best friend's Mexican. They're all sitting. He's surrounded by Mexicans. And my mom does this thing where she has maids come over, and then they're undocumented, and then she goes and makes him file the legal fees to help these people become citizens. So he has helped a couple of illegals become citizens. He's surrounded by Mexicans, etc. And we go, there was this joke. Somebody walked up and goes, well, why do you vote Republican? He goes, I love white supremacy. And he just left it there. And it's like, yeah, this is a joke. He's like, and he does this. He goes, see, my wife, my friend, the guy I consider my son, clearly I'm a white supremacist. That's what motivates me. The only thing that I can think when I voted for Donald Trump, clearly, right? I've had 8 people become citizens. I am dedicated to the supremacy of my skin. Makes sense. And I'm like, I don't like Trump. I have met some racist Trump supporters, but my stepdad's not racist. He voted for the tax policies because he wanted to help out with his family, who's half white and half Mexican. So, and he views all of his kids as his kids. My Anglo stepsisters are his daughters. I'm his son. He doesn't separate. So the money goes for everybody. It's not just, I'm making this money to help white people. There's a bunch of Latino people going to be benefiting from that. But no one cares. You're a white supremacist. Your wife's Mexican. You're still a racist. You're still a white supremacist. You must be dedicated to the philosophy of white supremacy. End of story. You voted for Trump. And as much as I don't like Trump and I detest him, that's madness. That's madness. That's insanity to not even be able to look at the person at all in their background and simply say, I don't know anything about you. Maybe you in your personal life support diversity, but I'm going to go what the news says and just label you this without getting to know you. That's madness. I also saw it with Gavin Newsom with his recall election. When they had the recall election against Gavin Newsom, anybody who supported the Republican-backed recall election is a white supremacist. My mom's full-blood Mexican. She backed it. I remember going to her that day going, Mom, you're a white supremacist. And she starts laughing and laughing. And then I hold the newspaper up to her face. She didn't laugh.
Yeah, that's the kind of rhetoric that's only hitting the hammer down further on just this division. This was like the takeaway that I was asked by my professors and trying to, how can we fix this? And I was like, well, I don't know. None of the essays say that there's really a fix. It's just usually it comes to a breaking point. But my only suggestions were that I had to take this from an academic lens, is that maybe the Republican Party could be more accepting towards these constantly changing norms through time, and the Democratic Party could be more understanding that generational values are going to be slower to adapt in general. On the Democratic Party side, what I suggested was to stop using this systemic racism or this demonizing rhetoric of, anything that celebrates America is automatically going to be white supremacist or fascist and so forth, because what the Republicans will view that as is just anti-American civic identity, basically, especially for older generations, everything that they've grown up with and learned to know about America. And that's with Gavin Newsom's calling anybody that voted against his position was as a white supremacist. That's just absolutely absurd. Of course, not everybody is a white supremacist. It's a very small fringe that actually believes in those sorts of things.
There are white supremacists. There are racist folks, and I hate them and I don't like them and they're real. But I just don't think we should be running around calling people something that they're not. You can vote for Trump and not have a dedication to a white nation as your only motivation. It's possible. And I think that it's a mistake for the media to go, nope, there's only one way you could be motivated. You can't possibly be, I'm just a businessman. I really try to stay out of the social issues. These tax policies are good. Nope. Your motivation must be racism. End of story. It's that's not fair or accurate. I do want to pick up on what you just said. It sounds like when you were doing your study, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said one of your professors or a couple of them said, so where does this go? Civil war? None of the professors seem to have a fix for this, and none of the studies you read seem to suggest that this gets fixed. Is that right? Am I incorrectly summarizing?
I think that pretty much covers. It's really difficult to see how you just get out of this sort of thing. What
Okay.
is basically, some of them were suggesting civil war could be a possibility. From what I've read, just because of the American context, we are a so-called consolidated democracy. We have a long history of being a democratic country. And we have, as you've shown on the maps here, we have Republicans and Democrats peppered all throughout. Democrats are going to be more the urban centers. Republicans are everywhere in rural parts of the U.S. So how a civil war would play out in this sense, it's not going to be as like clear cut as we see the South versus the North in the Civil War period. I don't think that's how this is going to happen. I think we're probably going to see more of those episodes of just political violence from the really radicalized party members that really want to act on, viewing the other side as an enemy or a threat to American way of life. And just the getting out of it, I think that, all that could probably happen is, one party consolidates control, whether that's just in these red and blue states where they're just more and more red or more blue. And power is just less federal, more along the state end of things, and this could be the way that it plays out, is that Republicans have a hard time maybe winning the executive branch again, and it sits with like maybe a dominant Democratic Party with a split Congress for here until something shakes things up and there's a breaking point.
I had a theory, and I wanted to run it by you. Just a theory of mine. You could say, hey, that's silly, doesn't make sense, or there's something there, or I love it. Anyway, oh no, that's silly, that's crazy, to, I love it. Gamut, whatever your opinion is. And I did not pay him. Okay, so this is his honest answer. I had a theory I've been developing, not saying it's for sure my opinion, but it's a theory I've been developing. Marjorie Taylor Greene says, hey, we need a national divorce. Our division is so bad. And what she said was the division is going to lead to a civil war, and I don't want that. We need to reduce the tension so it doesn't get to that level. And people said, well, you're crazy, but I have a theory that a lot of the experts were saying the issue for political polarization, if there is one, is social media, is the elite politicians, is gerrymandering, and absolutely no mention of the big sort, because those are solvable problems. You could, in theory, pass legislation to regulate social media companies. You could change election laws to make more moderate people be elected. Gerrymandering is a matter of law. But if we're talking about the people and themselves sorting themselves out personally over 3 decades, that's not a problem that gets fixed with a law or a good speech. That is a societal problem that would probably take another 3 decades to undo. And you have to get all 300 million people to do it, versus Facebook's a problem. I passed a new law to regulate social media companies. No more extreme social media posts. Fixed. You cannot pass a law, go, I'm Biden, and I got all the Republicans with me and all the Democrats, and we passed a law saying Americans will now start talking to each other and moving back to their diverse communities. What do you think about that theory, that we're not talking about the real issue because it looks unsolvable, so we'll talk about other things that are reasonably potential bad guys, but are solvable?
Yeah, that's interesting question. And with social media, the funny, or I guess ironic part is, if you shut down conversations online, all the people that are having these conversations shut down, they're just going to either move to a different platform or move underground and continue to have those conversations. And all this action is going to do is make them more hardened and radical in their views against whoever did that censorship or passed that legislation against them. With the regard to just, where and how is this coming from? Why is it happening? There is this relationship between the elites and their rhetoric or their political speech and how the masses are receptive to that. And a lot of the scholarship will suggest that it's a two-way street where, sometimes there's a supply and demand issue, that sometimes the public wants to hear more of this rhetoric. But there's also the supply side of things, which the academic scholarship suggests that the elites do have a heavy role in influencing these behaviors or political views. So I can't exactly recall the survey, but one particular study basically looked at different policy issues, whether they were both liberal and conservative, and then said, well, Trump approved of this policy and this policy and this policy. It could have been a blend of liberal and conservative policies. And what the survey respondents said was they were conservatives that actually changed their position to the liberal position just because Trump said he liked this position. So it's a matter of, if my preferred political party leader or my politician that I like a lot and identify with says this, then I also think this is great and I love it. And that's how I view things. And, that's my political inclination now. So I think more and more, as partisanship has become so important for our political system and society, is that people are leaning to those authorities in order to develop their own opinions. So maybe the way to counteract that is to try to reinforce critical thinking in our schools again. Like, think for yourself, have your own thoughts instead of just what he said or what the group thinks. Try to come up with your own position.
Radical thinking. They used to teach that when I was a high school boy. Now they don't. We live in a time now where Lester Holt can win the top journalist in America award last year, and in his acceptance speech say, telling both sides of the story is wrong, and real journalism is picking one side and just going with it. And he was celebrated for that and not condemned. And it's the total opposite of what Walter Cronkite would have said. Modern America, that's a fact. I agree with you. I think what I've seen is a theory is they feed on each other. Maybe people were sorting each other in the 90s, and then they go, why not have radical gerrymandering? Okay, why not have, I love these hateful posts since I moved to Texas from California. My neighbors are into it. And I love voting for extreme politicians now that everybody around me loves this stuff. So, and then it's a circle. It just keeps feeding on itself. Another extreme politician raises it up. People go, well, I expect more of that now. Get this virtual circle, but it still comes back down to the original source was people sorting themselves out, and you can't undo it until you get everybody to unsort themselves. That means all those people that left go back to their mixed communities. Something you said that grabbed me, and I've heard from others. I've heard this a lot from others. We used to have liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. Now we don't. There used to be some overlap in the parties. Now there's not. There's lots of charts showing that. It kind of matches with this. Okay, last questions. I do want to ask you about the 1960s, and I'd like to get your opinion on this. You could agree, you could disagree, whatever. Some people said the big difference between now and the 1960s was, one, we're sorting ourselves out into rural, urban, or different states. In the 1960s, people were part of one family. You might have a family sitting together at dinner, and mom and dad believe in the Vietnam War. Janie believes in burning her bra and against the Vietnam War. John Boy believes not going to the Vietnam War and that black people should have the right to vote. But they all had dinner together. Maybe they'd argue over the dinner table. But John Boy and Janie didn't go, screw you, mom and dad. We're moving to a total separate state because we think differently than you about the Vietnam War. I wasn't there at the time. I can only go off historical records. It doesn't seem to be as big a thing. The other thing was belief in common institutions. I've heard from people the 60s was much more violent than now. But people believed in the Supreme Court together, the presidency together, Congress together. Nobody would think, well, the Supreme Court said something, let's just ignore their ruling for our side. Or, I doubt your guy won the election for the next 4 years. Oh, yeah, well, I doubt your guy won the election for the next 4 years. You didn't have that. Now we have the lowest support and faith for Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, the federal government, the FBI, basically everything but the U.S. military. Lowest amount of support in 40 years. amongst the American people. Is it fair to say that the difference between now and the 60s was as bad as it got? People had a common belief in the courts and the legal system and elections, and now they do not.
I think that's a fair statement. And in the 60s, I think this goes back to with party sorting and the way polarization used to be. Polarization used to be more so on just like one or two issues, but since the 60s, it formerly was around economic and social welfare issues, and increasingly it's been more along those cultural lines and that's where the sorting comes into effect, is that, you know, they're centering on issues of not only economic and social welfare, where the parties are split on those ends, but now it's around culture, religion versus secularism, and moral issues like abortion, LGBTQ rights, and whatever it might be. These things that sorting is coming from this polarization around the old issues, but adding in this or this extension of just polarizing around this whole slate of issues, including moral issues that people really feel are like going down to their core of what they view as American society and way of life type of issues. So maybe that's part of that interplay of like, why are people moving to certain places? Well, it's because they see politics as now impacting their everyday life and who they are and what it means to Americans. So they're trying to just go to where they feel, you know, belonging.
That's brilliant. Sorry. So it is the people feeling the politics is affecting their everyday life more than maybe their grandparents did in the 50s and 60s, maybe even the 70s, and they're sort of emotionally, viscerally really reacting to that. And I really appreciate your commentary on the 1960s. Last question as we're winding down. Federalism. Hey, we could cure all this division with more federalism. Joe Biden gets elected, Texas wants to secede. Donald Trump gets elected, California wants to secede. We put so much power at the federal level that when somebody wins and it's the opposite political party, people are scared that what's going to happen to them. If we just reduced the amount of power the federal government had and we passed it more to the states, everything gets fixed. Thoughts, feelings?
I don't think there's going to be any intentional fix. I think what it might just de facto come down to is that because nothing's getting done in Washington, because we have a divided Congress, or, you know, the opposite in the executive branch, we just can't pass legislation to fix an issue, that then there's the states are just going to step in and try and do more than they have in the past. And I think with some evidence of that is just, you know, in Illinois, there's J.B. Pritzker, who's, you know, totally willing to take a heavy hand in policy and legislating. And in Florida, the opposite end, in a red state now, formerly purple, Ron DeSantis is doing the same thing. He's totally willing to do things that governors haven't necessarily done as so forthright as in the past. So I think, like probably no intentional fix to this issue. I think there's going to be this continued contestation over, like, you know, slamming the opponent in the federal ring of winning that national office, but we're still just probably not going to get much done. And I don't see, you know, a Democratic full majority Congress with a Democrat in office, or vice versa, probably happening anytime soon, because of the way we've been gerrymandered in so many places that we're just kind of stuck in this gridlock almost by our own doing.
When I started down this journey, I started this way because I was reading the news. I watched Marjorie Taylor Greene's tweet, and then I saw how the news covered it. And it was, like you were saying, a lot of name calling and insults. And this is from top level people. And I thought, that's ridiculous. It was something like, you know, you red state people get so much federal largesse. If you leave us, you know, you'll become instantly poor. You guys are all idiots. And then the response would be, well, you guys all run pedophile pizza rings. So screw you. No, 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 I meant screw you. And this is on TV. And I'm like, oh God, that's not even an adult level of conversation. You kind of took the wind out of my sails. Most people say federalism is a way, but you were kind of pointing out maybe it won't happen. Normally people would say, oh, federalism is a path. And then I would bring this up to them. So I'm going to bring this up to you and I want to get your response. Let's say you said federalism is the way forward. And I go, okay, there was this thing called Roe v. Wade, woman's right to choose over her body. And it was passed down to the states. It was not destroyed. It was passed back to the states, a move towards federalism. I'm here in California. I have a lot of friends in New York. Nobody in those liberal states were saying, great, power was passed to the states. We're protected. It was, oh my God, they're taking away our rights. They're coming for us. Let's freak out and panic and get pitchforks. And I remember having conversations with fellow liberals saying, they didn't take away our rights. This is California. We're never going to take away a woman's right to choose, that we'll have guns or whatever we do before that. Relax. No relaxing. You took away the national one. You're coming to get us. So almost no embrace of federalism by the left on that side on this idea. Then we can go to the right. We can look at Republicans. And they have been saying for generations, federalism. Okay. They get their first big test to live up to what they've talked about in decades. And what do? Mike Pence comes out and says, not good enough. I want a national abortion ban. He's not condemned by fellow Republicans, and he's supported by fellow Republicans. So if we have one party that outright rejects federalism when it was given back to them, and we have another party pull the biggest level of hypocrisy a political party could pull in the last century, what chance do we have of real federalism being enacted?
Right. It's states' rights all the way, unless it's my issue, right? So I think that's what it is it's a hypocrisy, but I think it's just just comes with the job of being a politician. I think it was the comment that Trump made in his recent interview with CNN that it was over the budget crisis. It's like, and when he was president, he was asked, he said there should be no negotiations over lifting the budget ceiling due to the effect that would have on the U.S. His answer was just totally a nonchalant, well, that's when I was president. And so right now he says there should be negotiations. And he said, well, because I'm not president. And that just goes back to when it's in my favor, I want it to be this way. But when it's not in my favor, I want it to be that way. So I think where the kind of hypocrisy on the Republicans who have historically been the states' rights party, that they come in and say well, I still want a national abortion ban. It's because they want to legislate over the other party and vice versa.
So there really isn't any purveyors or champions of federalism then. Okay. I hope that you found that this was not a gotcha journalism interview. You got to say what you wanted. It was fair. Is that fair? It was a fair interview?
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, Marcus. It's been an interesting conversation.
I really appreciated your knowledge base. Do you have any recommendations? We want to keep the thoughtful conversations going. Do you know anybody who might be interested in having a thoughtful conversation? They'd be left, right, academic, not academic. Just want to have conversations about political division in America.
That's an awesome question. I wish I had something off the cuff somebody that could reference, but it's few and far between that somebody wants to have a sober conversation that's just not overtly partisan. So I think probably the sources to go to are the folks that are actually having conversations with the other side. I know the Breaking Points, they do a good job of that. Sagar and Crystal Ball. Glenn Greenwald, he's also kind of slices it in between. Now people refer to him as a white supremacist or far right, but he's still he's definitely left wing. He just doesn't agree with the Democratic Party.
Yeah, the man has not changed who he is or what he reports on in years. So if he's a white supremacist now, he was always one.
Those few people, there's plenty more out there that just have, that more independent lens of looking at the world. And in general, I think it's just really trying to pull in someone even from both sides just to get the perspective on both ends of it and trying to see where there's overlap and figuring out the problem.
Good show. But I will point out Breaking Points the day of misled everybody and acted like they never reported on national division before. So they did. And they were another one of the channels where I'm like, did you guys forget what you talked about 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 18, totally the day of. There's no issue. I remember seeing Crystal Ball go, I don't know what she's talking about. We all get along. So it happens everywhere. Okay. If you could place yourself outside of your body and you're watching this interview, we've had a great conversation. It's 5 days from now, 5 days now from now. You're not you. You're a random person watching this. And this person goes, I watched that interview. There was a lot of good stuff, more than I can really remember. Boy, did they get in depth. Wow, was that really quality? But there was this one thing the guest said at the end, and I cannot get that out of my head. What is that one thought you would like the average viewer to not be able to forget 5 days from now?
I think what the viewer should remember is that when we're talking about problems in American democracy, that it's not just a totally Republican problem. It's not a Democratic Party problem. It's our problem. It's a bipartisan issue. And I think what example I would call out is that even in the 2020 presidential elections, Trump repeated that he would only lose if the radical Democrats rigged it. But at the same token, Hillary Clinton made a Facebook post, and Democrats were worried about election legitimacy because they thought Trump would meddle in the ballots. And so what I would consider is that if the Democrats won the election, Republicans would say it was rigged. If Republicans won the election, Democrats would say there were problems with election legitimacy. So it's not clear that either side could conceive of the other as winning an election fairly, and that we're in a pattern of polarization, that trust in the institutions is on a downward spiral, and that we have to really have a sober conversation and talk about that and not be afraid to actually have a discussion with our political opponents.
Is it easy to have these kind of conversations now? Is it hard? I think you were saying sometimes people aren't necessarily up for an honest conversation, it seems like.
Yeah, that's the tricky part, is there's, people shut down when there's disagreements nowadays. They don't want to interact, and they view the other as, white supremacist or a fascist or, whatever it might be. And we just have to try to remember that in a democratic society, we have to be able to tolerate each other as legitimate political opponents in order to actually have that dialogue and to make democracy work. Otherwise, we're going to end up in a more and more authoritarian society, and I don't think anybody necessarily wants us to get to that point.
I don't like Trump. I think he's a dog whistlinger, but I have a lot of conservative friends. Some of them were hardcore Trump voters. I still stayed friends with them, and I still listened to them. Not necessarily agreed with them. And in return, I have to admit, some of the things that were said in the mainstream media about Trump were just straight up lies. And if I didn't have my conservative friends, I never would have known that, because the information comes out years later, and then it's not promoted in the mainstream or left news. It only comes out in the right news. You never even hear about it. I can't tell you the number of things that I have found out mainstream media said about Trump was not true, and it's come out as a fact that they did that. And when I talk to fellow liberals, they have no idea. They're like, "Oh, really? What? Really? That happened? Yeah. And this happened? When did that happen? 2 years ago. It came out as a total lie." No concept of any of that. Absolutely none. And the only reason that I'm a liberal and know is that I have a lot of conservative friends, and I'm willing to tell myself, maybe you should bite your tongue and listen more than yelling and giving your opinion. And that's the only reason why I know things that other liberals don't. That's it.
Yeah, we don't agree on the same facts anymore. We have partisan facts.
We don't. I was trying to tell people about how I think January 6th was a coup too. Okay. But they had cops opening the doors. And I'm like, what about this? No, we don't need to talk about that. Let's just prosecute everybody. And I go, how do we know any of these cops are in on it? Oh, because they said so. We know they're not in on it because all of them told us so. Okay. And then it comes out later that QAnon shaman, after they prosecuted him and sent him to jail for years, the video comes out afterwards, and it shows him just being let in casually. by multiple guards. There's no one else around him. There's no crowds. It's 3 guards, and they go, yeah, come on in. He was totally let out, and their case was destroyed. You will never hear about that in mainstream news, and almost no liberals know about that. Modern America today. So, last minute thoughts. Would you like people to contact you? Do you have anything you want to promote, an artwork site or website or anything? You don't have to.
I got nothing to promote, Marcus. I appreciate the opportunity, but it's been an interesting interview. So again, thanks for the reaching out and putting this together.
I will email you soon a copy of the video. We really appreciate it. And if you can think of anybody else who's willing to have an honest conversation, we don't care where they're from. We just want to have this. It's called dialogue, folks. I don't know if you know what you're seeing. This is called dialogue, where I might be wrong. I might be right. I show up to find out. And I'm not concerned if people find out, oh, Marcus was wrong on that. Okay, let's all learn together. We used to be okay with this. We used to be okay with learning together. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Nick Mullins, Masters of Science in Political Science. Appreciate it. And I will email you a copy of the video shortly. Thank you for being
here. Sounds great. Thanks a lot.